Hello and welcome to the NEA Big Read, Central Florida. My name is Julia Listengarten and I'm a professor of theater and artistic director in the School of Performing Arts at the University of Central Florida. I'm also one of the organizers of UCF's Big Read programming. An initiative of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest, the NEA Big Read broadens our understanding of our world, our communities, and ourselves through the joy of reading. A great book brings people together, and it is critical that we maintain our connections to one another, especially in times of crisis. This year, we partnered with Seminole County Public Libraries and the Veterans Legacy Program to offer programs in celebration of the 30th anniversary of the publication of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. Published in 1990, The Things They Carried is a collection of short stories based on the author's own experiences as a soldier in the 23rd Infantry Division during the Vietnam War. Inspired by the book, this series of talks asks artists to consider how we respond to crisis and to think about the ways in which the arts respond to war and trauma. Today, we're pleased to welcome Darcy Parker Bruce. Darcy is a playwright and educator from New Haven, Connecticut, and a graduate of the MFA Playwriting program at Smith College. They're currently part of the faculty at several Connecticut colleges where they teach playwriting and theater activism. Darcy was the recipient of a 2017 Tennessee Williams Scholarship through the Sewanee Writers Conference and was granted ATHE's 2018 Judith Royer Award for Excellence in Theater, which brought her new play, Soldier Poet, to Boston. Today's talk via Zoom will be structured as follows. The artist presentation will be approximately 30 minutes. We will hold 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. Attendees' videos and microphone are set to off, but please type your questions for the speaker in the chat box to the right, and I will ask your questions at the end of the presentation. A video of the recording will be available later this week on the Big Read website, where you can also find a list of upcoming programs. Thank you all for joining us for today's presentation, and I will now turn it over to Darcy Parker Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you so much to everyone at UCF for inviting me into this process and for making time for this talk and time to talk about art and making it work, sort of regardless of the situation. Thank you. So I wanted to start first of all by saying I'm nervous because I think it's always nice to normalize being nervous. So you might hear me shuffling some papers. But one of the first things, that I really wanted to talk about was, how do stories frame our reality and how can we find comfort in them? Especially right now, kind of with everything that's happening, how can we turn chaos into cosmos? Because I really think that ultimately that's what art is seeking to do, is sort of, organize chaos that already exists in our world. And we as artists, myself as a playwright, I enter a lot of the work by trying to answer questions that I have that I don't necessarily have an answer for. So I thought today I could kind of ask some of those questions and then talk about them. I may not find an answer, but I can kind of share some of those questions. So one of my first questions, how do art and war collide, and how is what we're writing through conflict of its own? How does art specifically impact our survival in times like this? And I think that, one of the things that helps us with art is that other people have asked the same questions that we have and tried to answer them. And I think that's something big, right, that Tim O'Brien is doing and the things they carried. When we consider, kind of how we're working through great traumas or how we're working through times of conflict, one of the major things we have to consider is how we see ourselves in relationship to community and how we see ourselves as individuals. Is there is there this impact of survivor's guilt, who leaves and who stays, and how do you return? So that's a question that kind of I'm always asking in regards to kind of how I exist. You know, I'm from Southeastern Connecticut. We have, you know, an enormous amount of folks in this area who are tied to the Army in the military. And one of the questions that we're always asking is how do you, you know, sort of what are we exchanging, right? When you go off to fight a conflict for someone else, you know, what does that look like? And sort of that's the genesis for the first Piedmont play, Soldier Poet, which then of course turned into the sequel, The Place That May Do. And so a lot of it is, you know, sort of folks in times of trauma or coming out of times of trauma, trying to find, you know, home and where they belong. And I think that a lot of what I'm doing in my art is asking, you know, what does it mean to be an American? You know, what are you being asked to exchange for this right to be a citizen? And then what are you receiving in return? Because Ben in this play goes off, you know, to sort of fight this war, and of course doesn't make it, you know, comes back as a ghost. And so here is the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate price to pay, and who's kind of benefiting from that? And I don't know that I necessarily have all of the answers, but those are certainly some questions that I'm looking for the answers to. Yeah, so just turning chaos into cosmos, you know, how do we kind of consider, you know, who's going off to war? You know, why do people make this decision? So coming out of an area that has really big class divides, sort of Connecticut's thought of as a very wealthy area, but certainly most of it isn't. And a lot of folks are kind of making the decision to join, you know, the military because there's a benefits package that comes with that. I, you know, have attended universities where there's a big table, you know, that's like, you know, you can get funding for college, or, you know, how will you basically make your next steps in life? How are you seen as successful? And what does that success look like? And success, I think, is sometimes seen as being very linear. You know, there are these correct steps that you have to take in order to get to that, you know, sort of very ambiguous end role. And so with my work, just trying to explore different ways that people can be successful, different ways that marginalized folks can land in communities and families, specifically after having moved through significant trauma, whether that trauma is the trauma of war or the trauma of home life, you know, et cetera. So I think that there are a lot of ways that you have to ask, how do people leave and how do people come home? Can we make art that matters, art that challenges us, art that's immediate in its accessibility and urgency? Can we make this art without crisis? That's a big question that I've been asking myself recently, especially, you know, now I read a lot of new plays. I work with students developing their new plays, and it's always interesting to see, you know, where art is born, where a story is born, you know, and oftentimes some of the art that I find the most appealing is coming out of crisis or coming out of conflict, or is coming as part of a very complicated healing process. But can there be this light without darkness? Can we tell stories without having to survive some kind of atrocity? And I don't know if there's an answer to that either, but I think that there's something so fantastic about art in its complete and immediate urgency that responds to the world that we are living in, that remains accessible, you know, because it speaks to so many different communities, and because it speaks to truths that that are not generally discussed around dinner tables. So art that's dangerous, and art that talks about these things, you know, because I don't think we talk enough about how, you know, how people return from war, and we don't talk enough about trauma. And I don't even mean that we need to sit down and talk about all of these nitty-gritty details, but, you know, there should be a conversation about, yeah, just about how you return home and how you find your grounding and how you move through grief, because I think it takes a lot longer than we think it does. And so this is something, again, that I try to address in my work, you know, through these characters who are just trying to find the same answers. I think the best plays are trying to find the answers to impossible questions. And I think that we are all full of impossible questions. What can conflict teach us about living with community is a question that I have here. I think living with community, you know, there's this kind of expectation that the community looks a certain way too, right? It's the same kind of thing as success being linear when we live in areas, and I write a lot about being queer in small town pockets. And so I think that, you know, there's a very specific way that conflict and traumatic pasts enter into specific communities, and kind of what's allowed to be talked about and what's not. And again, it's just kind of that, how do we keep extending that conversation of, you know, how do folks look at different points in their lives, or how do folks who didn't have, you know, the same origin as other folks, like how are they moving along their path, and how are people interacting and connecting through the place that made you. You know, Jonah's search is for home, the thing that is the most important. I think to Ben, to Jonah, to Emily, to all of the characters in the world of Piedmont, to Bud, everyone just wants to kind of land permanently, right? To find a place that they can call safe, right? And that safe place, and I think, I mean, certainly recently, you know, we've been learning this concept of safety is something we want very badly, but never really something that can be guaranteed. And so I think art has to investigate how we live and interact with that truth, with the truth that we are responsible for each other. And I think that's another big part of how conflict, you know, sort of interacts with community. We have to learn how to do things together and how to support one another. For Jonah, someone who desperately wants to be part of something, Jonah wants to be part of a family, he wants to be part of a unit, he wants to be part of a place. And I think that for someone like Jonah, who feels so rejected, you know, sort of at every turn, you know, that is absolutely the quest. And so the answer to that is a lot more complicated, and the series, the cycle of plays, will eventually answer that, but it takes, you know, it kind of takes a long time to get there. And I think a lot of us are still trying to answer that question for ourselves, especially when you started out with, you know, if you have roots in trauma, you know, figuring out what grounding looks like is a big part of, you know, how you become a person. Ben is kind of carrying this fantastic sense of responsibility, whereas Jonah feels as if he's sort of bucked all responsibility, right? And so there's this interesting dynamic between the two of them too, when you see who Ben has been trained to be, from having been, you know, a ranger, and having had to think as a unit, versus Jonah, who's been rejected throughout most of his life. And I think that's an interesting dynamic too. And having known folks from both camps, and being in you know, one of those camps myself, I think it's interesting to kind of to continue to see how those two people meet up against each other, you know, and how can people who are feeling more buoyed, I guess, and more supported than other people, like those people who are feeling more rooted in trauma, like how can those two people come together and continue to carry each other? And, you know, how can someone who's, you know, had this history of rejection, you know, sort of overcome this anger that consumes them and doesn't allow them to move forward, right? Jonah has all of this anger, you know, and I think that's such a big part of, you know, my community, the queer community. Like there's a lot of anger there. There's a lot of folks who haven't, you know, who've wanted to be a part of something, who feel like they don't need permission to be part of somewhere, and to feel that community space. And so there's a lot of anger over having been rejected, and that anger is justified and it comes from a real place. But in order to live beautifully and successfully, in order to not just survive, but to thrive, and that's truly what I want for everyone in my community, I want them to thrive. And I think that a big part of kind of, you know, getting to that place is realizing where that anger is coming from, and feeling it and giving yourself permission to be angry, and then figuring out how you can live in the world, you know, with a balance of the truth of that anger, but the beauty of everything that hasn't happened yet, because we lose so many people, I think, because for too many reasons, we lose too many people. And I wanted to give our community one more day, you know, just one more reason to kind of keep going to the beach and watching the sunrise, or knocking on a friend's door, or, you know, trying to find housing, if that's not something that you have right now. So I think the truth of it too, is kind of how do people walk through conflict, especially when you've been walking through conflict or trauma for the majority of your life. How are you walking through it with intent and finding the end? And sometimes you can't do it by yourself, and so, you know, you need this kind of unit that forms, either, you know, because you're like Ben, an Army Ranger, and you've been assigned somebody, or because you're from, you know, a specific area and your community is rallying around you and saying, listen, you can't walk on your own right now, and it's okay to lean on me. And I think that's got to be a big part of a conversation. You know, Jonah, there's a lot of this conversation in the play about how different people see God, you know, this idea of God, whether God for you is, you know, a religious deity, like, you know, one sort of all-seeing person, you know, my brother calls God Sky Daddy, and I enjoy that. Or if God is kind of this concept, right, of, you know, we are always working in relation to everyone else. You know, we are part of a higher concept that we assume means we'll all try to take care of each other. And so for me, you know, when I think of that, like, you know, when Ben thinks of that, when Emily thinks of, you know, the divine and holy light of God, whether it's a joke, whether it's really something you're experiencing in that moment, it's this idea that, you know, we are a part of something that's bigger than ourselves, right? And that, again, it's just that mentality of not saying, you know, I'm just gonna, you know, kind of expect that God will take care of everything, but more, how do I interact, you know, with everyone I love or everyone I want to help, by understanding that I am acting as part of a community, you know, and that community itself is kind of that concept, I guess, of God or something larger than us. And so I think that, you know, when Ben can see that and when Emily can see that, Jonah's frustrated because he hasn't seen that yet. And it's really, really hard, you know, kind of to imagine the great and glorious light of God when you yourself feel like you're trying to have the relationship with this beautiful thing that you see people in your life whom you love, you see them having that relationship, but you yourself can't find it. And so for Jonah, you know, this script kind of being a retelling of Jonah and the Whale, it's just this, again, this exploration of anger and refusal and I think struggle, just trying and trying and trying so hard to become a part of something, and then, you know, sort of not being able to, even though you're trying, you know, just there's still something that's coming up against you. Yeah, I think, you know, I think that the relationship between art and conflict too, you know, it encourages us to ask a lot of the hard questions that we're not asking, to imagine a brighter kind of, I want to say, concrete future. And I think that that's just something, you know, these characters kind of have to keep working for. And then there are these pockets that shine. But yeah, art is always asking us, who are we in relation to the world? And who are we in relationship to our communities? You know, I think Jonah very much doesn't want to be seen as a coward. But at the same time, you know, one of the first lines in the play is, you know, I would have joined up with Ben if they let me. And there's this sort of exploration of what it means to want to be part of something, and you know, Jonah as a trans person, you know, wanting to follow Ben into the military and then not feeling as though that was really an option for him, and then also not feeling as though he's welcome in this conflict either. So not welcome in war, and then also, you know, sort of how will I fit in with a group of people who maybe don't understand me the same way as this person who I've grown up with. And so, you know, Jonah very much wanting to prove his worth, and then over and over again, finding that he's just still trying to, I think, trying to find a place so badly that he can't, he just can't stay still enough sometimes. Yeah, so I think, of course, there's comfort to be had in stories, and I think that the most important thing, though, about understanding how stories can frame the times that we're living in is that these stories have to be from so many different experiences, and they have to speak to so many different communities, and they have to be willing to address a lot of the hard truths, you know, and what conflict stories do, what trauma stories do, is say, we're going to ask questions that people don't normally talk about. So I wanted to read a poem really quickly as well. This is a poem called Soldier Poet by Hervey Allen. I think at first, like us, he did not see the goal to which the screaming eagles flew, for romance lured him France and chivalry. But oh, before the end, he knew, and gave his first full love to liberty, and met her face to face one lurid night, while the guns boomed their shuddering minstrelsy, and all the Argonne glowed with demon light. And liberty herself came through the wood, and with her dear boy lover kept the tryst, clasped in her hand Greek arms. In her grand Greek arms he understood whose were the fatal lips that he had kissed. Lips that the soul of youth has loved from old, hot lips of liberty that kiss men cold. And the reason that I love this poem is particularly because it asks us, you know, what are we exchanging for liberty, right? Is the price too high? And the people who go in search of that, I guess, the people who go, you know, the folks in my community who've gone to war, the folks in your community who've gone to war, you know, when they come back, are they getting what they paid for? So I think that question frames a lot of my work, and particularly the Piedmont series. And just seeing what Tim O'Brien has done in his work has been so inspiring, because it's important for me to feel like I have a voice in helping people find a way to come back. And I want to read this quote by Tim O'Brien, and then I was going to give an exercise, a writing exercise, but I think I might actually not have enough time. So I'll give it, and then if you want to engage with it after this, you're more than welcome to do so. Stories are for joining the past to the future. Stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity, when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story. Tim O'Brien. And so I thought an excellent writing exercise, and I might ask my students to do this week as well. I would like you to think about what you're carrying right now, whether it's through isolation, whether it's through something, is it something you've been carrying before quarantine? Is it something that has specifically kind of expressed itself recently and you're not sure what that is? Is it metaphorical? Is it something you can touch? And normally I would give 10 to 15 minutes and ask my students to just sort of free write on that subject. And so I would ask you to do the same as well. It's my cat. So, and that's about it for me.
Thank you, Darcy.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much for such heartfelt and and personal presentation. You made us think about very difficult questions. Thank you so much for that. So I have one question right now that I want to ask, and if there's some other questions, please post them in the chat box. So there's a bit of a response and a bit of a question. I love Darcy's impossible questions, and I'm always curious to ask playwrights how they know they are the right people to explore those questions and or issues. Are there questions they care about that they don't feel comfortable writing about?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. And it's actually something we talk about a lot in my playwriting classes, and that I think I've just talked to various theater folk and playwrights about over the history of a career. So I think you know, the answer is complicated, and it might be different for everybody. For me, you know, I ask myself how I'm entering the story. If I'm entering the story through eyes that are just, you know, sort of like, am I watching the situation or am I actually experiencing? You know, is this something that I've experienced and I've lived? And I can say for my work anyway, everything I'm writing about is something I've experienced or lived, or I'm writing for a specific community for, you know, which I'm a part of. And so that's important to me only because, again, with the impossible questions, my impossible questions are generating from my experience, my lived experience. And so, and I think that maybe that's the answer, right? Like, where are your impossible questions being generated? And do you really have, like, are they interesting enough to you, right? And I think that if it's not your story to tell, or if it's not part of your immediate community, or, you know, where you came from, it might not be as interesting, you know? And so I think, you know, certainly there's respect to be played, right? Like, you have to be very careful about, you know, sort of whose story you're telling and why you feel interested enough to tell that story. But certainly, certainly a lot of what you're writing is coming from your lived experiences. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, very helpful. Thank you, Darcy. I have another question. This question is specifically in relation to your trilogy that you mentioned. Maybe you can tell us a little more about where you are in terms of play development, and can talk a little bit about the sequence. So for the Pegasus Play Lab, we picked the middle play, I understand. Yes. So if you can talk a little bit about how the story develops. And then I have a follow-up question, my own question. So we are in the times of crisis right now. It's a health crisis and economic crisis. And because you are in the process of developing this trilogy, I wonder, intentionally or unintentionally, you think that the crisis we're in would somehow inform your play development process.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Yeah, okay, so I will talk about the series a little bit. So it's a cycle of plays. I was originally calling a trilogy, but now I think it's 4 plays. And so it begins with a play called Soldier Poet, you know, which is about 2 American Army Rangers in Syria. And then the story kind of follows the ghost of one of the Rangers back home to their hometown of Piedmont, which is based on my hometown in Connecticut, one of my hometowns. I'm from 2 places, but and so and then investigates specifically, primarily queer relationships and how, you know, how queer folks form families or find grounding after specific traumatic events. And so this one, The Place That Made You, is Jonah's journey and his search for home, which by the end of the play it is available to read on New Play Exchange if anybody's interested. Spoiler alert. By the end of the play, is sort of given, he's given the chance to start a family, you know, if he makes certain choices. And so the next play, The Kingdom of Ghosts, takes place a year later. Currently writing that now. It's a lot more investigation of the building of queer families. So I think, you know, Jonah was searching for family, and now he's going to have to navigate what that family looks like. And at the same time, Ben's ghost still hasn't left Piedmont. So I want to also continue to explore that question. You know, what do we exchange when we go to war? How do we go to war, and how do we come home? Because again, I think we know a little bit more about the going to than the coming home from. And then the fourth play in the cycle, which right now I plan for that to be the final play, will be called And So Sing I Your Praises. And I'm not sure at what point. I know it takes place in the future. I'm not sure at what point in the future, whereas Ghost takes place exactly a year after the beginning of The Place That Made You. And then And So Sing I Your Praises, for me, it just, and I think I've spoken about this before, you know, marginalized voices, often our stories aren't told by us, or they're, you know, a little exploitative, or very exploitative, or we're focusing on a trauma specific to a community. And it is really important for me to address certain traumas specific to communities, because those things are truthful. And I think that we need more stories that normalize those. We need more stories that start that conversation. But at the same time, I think it's really important to give characters a chance to land in lightness and hope, and to not see, you know, characters that represent us in our communities snuffed out, you know, sort of halfway through or by the end, or living in misery, etc. And so for me, this is kind of a gift, I'm hoping. It's for me. I'm writing the series for me, but then I'm also writing it for a community of people for whom I hope will feel buoyed, or feel like, you know, there are so many ways to define family, and that's how we'll get there in this play. Support-wise, I've got, Place That Made You has 3 productions upcoming, none of which have been canceled, one of which has been postponed, but there will be a podcast version of the play reading available soon. And I've spoken with a couple of theaters about receiving developmental support for the cycle, and I think now, you know, funding is precarious, to say the least. So I think that we'll see. I do think that, thank you, Julia, for that question, because speaking of anger, I feel frustrated often when I hear folks talk about how, you know, we need to have lightness, or we need to have comedy. Like, of course, we need, you know, we need to not be in the thick of drama all of the time, especially now because everything feels so heavy. But I mean, there are really important things that we have to talk about, and that is what American theater does. It pushes these, you know, these topics to the forefront of our conversation, and it makes them accessible so that large groups of people can come together. And I think that that is what theater is. That's theater's function. I mean, certainly we all want a night of entertainment, but I want to uplift communities, and I want to encourage dialogue and conversation and unity. And I think that that only comes by beginning someplace that's hard to get to, and continuing to do the hard work, as well as making people laugh.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, I don't have any other questions from the participants, but I have one more question that I'm sort of curious. I'd like to ask, and I'm curious to hear your response. In your bio, it says that you teach playwriting and theater activism. Mm-hmm. And in light of this conversation today about different ways artists respond to war and trauma, particularly right now in the times of crisis. So I wonder how you approach this topic with your students. How do you, what are the ways you discuss their responsibility? Is there a particular methodology that you may have?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, it's really like, you know, this kind of conversation we're having now is the cornerstone of what I drone on about to my students. You know, we're very interactive. You know, I've asked students to kind of think of themselves and of creating theater in the context of quarantine and isolation, thinking of community and collaboration being the cornerstones for theater, and how a lot of theater is born. I think, you know, we have this idea now that Broadway, you know, is sort of the be all end all of theater, and Broadway is wonderful, you know, for different reasons, but theater is cheap, on the fly. What did I find in my house, or what have I found in my yard, or who can I convince to kind of come and say these words with me? And so for us, for our classes, for theater as a tool for social activism, I think that like the biggest focus, I think, is just on continuing to build that community and to think about how art has to be urgent. You know, I'm always telling my students, why this play now? Asking my students why this play now? Why is this the story you need to tell? Where is the urgency? You know, what has the story been born from? And so I've had students in my playwriting class who were writing scripts and had, you know, one-act plays that they had drafts of a month and a half ago that those drafts are gone. And I said, you know, because they didn't know how to finish those plays, and I told them if they wanted to put those aside and just spend time reacting in different work to what's happening right now, that was more important. And that's what the majority of them have chosen to do that. And it's going well, I think, and a lot of interesting art is coming out of that. So I think if any methodology, it's only, you know, that we have to look directly into something. You know, we have to be able to sit in our discomfort, and we have to be able to, you know, to read the work of other people who are doing the same thing. So we're just kind of constantly in conversation with, you know, other writers who have similar questions, and then we're also, you know, looking at the world around us as truthfully as possible, and challenging it when appropriate and necessary.
Thank you so much. I have a comment, and that comment would probably conclude our discussion. It's not really a question. The comment says, please tell Darcy how wonderful their answers are, and that it's so uplifting to hear Darcy's talk about how important, how challenging it is to think and talk about the hard issues, the sort of difficult issues.
Thank you.
So I want to join that and say, yeah, it's been a pleasure to hear you talk and hear your responses to our questions. And thank you so much for participating in the series.
Thank you. Thank you for making space, and thanks to your students very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.